We're moving to part number 3 of the conference, which is all about aligning people, tech, and leadership in Agile transformation. And I would like to welcome our next speaker, Jurgen de Ruijter, who is the member at ERSTE Card Club. He is responsible for strategy, digital development, finance, risk, and IT. Just a little bit about ERSTE Card Club, although I'm sure that Jurgen will be sharing this in more detail. It's one of the largest credit card companies in Croatia, with several subsidiaries in Slovenia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Macedonia. Jurgen is actually joining us from Zagreb. He is highly skilled change manager with extensive experience in rebuilding organizations, including digital transformation, business development, geographical consolidation, and many, many more. While we were talking, the two of us, we actually thought that it's like the most important thing that Jurgen also now brings to the table is not only his great experience, you know, on the let's say high levels of the organization, but when it comes to agile transformation, he also brings this first-hand experience because he really likes to roll up his sleeves and work together with the teams to really understand what's going on, and then bring the knowledge back to the leadership level. So again, asking the audience to ask questions so that we also can anticipate how much time we need later. And then without further ado, we're a little bit behind time, but it's okay. I would like to hand it over to Jurgen.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
yes,
perfectly. Okay, thank you very much for Lenka, for the introduction. And let me just, let's say, switch screen, let's say, towards the presentation so that we can run through that. Just give me 1 second. Okay.
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
Do you see the present? Perfect. Okay. So title of the presentation is definitely that introducing Agile is an organizational determining tool. So this is very important in terms of sort of like transformation of the organization itself in order to actually, of course, ultimately, let's say, perform better. But it's definitely not a panacea. It just doesn't going to solve every problem, let's say, which we have as an organization. But just to bring you a little bit in terms of ERSTE Card Club, as Fabiana mentioned, that I'm the member of the board. I started there by late 2017, actually beginning of 2018, together with one other colleague. So it's just the two of us who are now running the company. And the previous managing board was set aside. So we had some sort of a clean slate to start with. And that's more or less what you see here on the presentation. So let me just run you through that. So ERSTE Card Club is, as mentioned, a standalone credit card company. We are part of a subsidiary of Erste Bank Croatia. We're not just operating in Croatia itself. We're also having some entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have one in Slovenia. We still have also licenses, let's say, all over the place. So it's rather a diversified company. And the offering is very much focused, let's say, we have a Diners card, which is, for most of you, let's say, a relatively traditional card. Considering, let's say, that Diners is not operating everywhere without Europe. It has been in some of the countries. So I'm a Dutchman, let's say, to give you an example. And I can't remember, let's say, after the 1980s to ever have seen a Diners card. But in Croatia and in this part of the world, it is still a very actively used card. And the company itself is very profitable. But of course, same as other financial institutions, let's say, we've seen margin erosions. We saw some sales number declining. But nonetheless, I mean, it has a very interesting proposition, which effectively is our customer base can pay installments and for free, meaning there are no hidden fees or anything attached to that. So they can make purchases between 3 to 12 months, even up to 36 months free of charge. Of course, let's say the merchant is effectively, let's say, paying a little bit for that. But this is really a strong sales argument in this market because, of course, let's say lower income base. But then again, when we stepped in, let's say there's a payment market, which is pretty much a very, let's call it local or domestic oriented payment market. So PBZ is the main competitor for us, which is Group Paulo and Tesa. And of course you have Zaba, which actually is UniCredit. And we had some sort of, let's call it, dynamic in that market taking place when we came in, is that we knew that American Express, which operated in exactly the same model as Diners does, would have to be converted into a Visa, or at that point in time, we didn't even know, let's say, what kind of card brand they would choose. So somehow one of the major competitors had to do something. And of course, that gave us a nice entry point to start maybe targeting their portfolio. But at the same time, the whole payment market in itself is changing. So you can clearly see cash to card conversion coming in. You see on the POS terminals, so on the point of sale where you're swiping your card or anything like this, more competition effectively, let's say, takes place. You see the new entries coming in, let's say peer-to-peer payments or Revolut or anything like that. So that again has impact on the whole payment domain. And of course, not to forget the regulatory burdens, which is also for payment institutions are applicable, like anti-money laundering, PSD2, and of course some regulations also automatically placed pressure effectively on the margins due to the ICF, so the interchange fee type of regulations. So all of that is sort of like the mix on which we actually stepped in. And at the same time, if you really look at closer towards the company itself, what you see there, it's you don't have to read all of this. I mean, in essence, what we saw was a super traditional old-fashioned organization, meaning everything was paper-based, very hierarchical, very silo oriented, actually no digital tools even available. And so you imagine this is 2018, so we're not even, let's say, that long ago. We did have a website, which was of course not interactive. The traditional bank branches were actually the main sales channels. All the customer base, at least that portion of the customer base, was actually very much serviced via mail and call center and pretty much inert. So very difficult to somehow move from one place to another. So you can imagine, let's say, and this list goes on and on. So a lot of stuff actually had to happen in order to sort of like elevate this company towards the next level. In that, what we said is, okay, strategically, what are we looking at? And this is maybe a very simplified slide, but actually on the from my side, it's the left-hand side. You see, let's say, the cardholder base. Of course, the thing what we want to do with the cardholder base is very simple. You of course want to increase the cardholder base. You want to sort of like increase the volumes attached to it, that they use the card more, etc., etc. So somehow we needed to find a tool to effectively increase that engagement on that side. And at the same time, you have merchant base, which of course where the card effectively is accepted and where the payments actually take place. But these merchants also would like to have something. They would like to actually communicate as much as possible towards the cardholder base and offer their offers to that cardholder so that they actually spend at their shops. So what we said is, okay, this is a platform because you have two sides of the equation where somehow this interaction takes place. And how to do that is more or less, let's say, that we are using digital tools. So on the cardholder base, the mobile, while on the merchant base, actually a merchant platform, so that we actually try to make sure that the engagement between these two sides intensify. And as such, of course, more volume will go over our platform. And as such, we will, as a company, hopefully earn a little bit more money and can at the same time improve our processes. So in terms of the experience, but at the same time, of course, also try to figure out if we can digitize many of the processes in order to make them actually cheaper. So we started from, let's call it this direction, and it's a simplified slide, but there's a lot of presentations effectively behind this one. But what we said is, okay, if we start with digitalization, in order to make this, to effectively execute this strategy, you have to take a holistic approach. You cannot just sort of like cherry pick. You more have to tackle every little thing in the company. So we looked at the products and services and tried to figure out what we can do there. We looked at operations, we looked at the go-to-market strategies, and of course, underneath it, we would have to look at, let's say, the people and organization. How do we deal with data and analytics, and what kind of technology we were actually using? So this is what we set out. We defined this, and for every little box, we have plans defined and executed in the meantime to realize this. So what I said earlier in terms of the strategic part is that we have said is that the mobile would be the cornerstone for the retail customer relationship. So this is where the communication channel actually takes place, where the digitized card services will actually be brought in, but also that we are able to actually offer potentially new digital features as such. And how to do that, of course, is that you have to change your development process. So we were looking at, and this is sort of like where we are started to, let's call it, introducing agile development, is that, of course, we were looking at end-to-end digital. So it cannot be is that we're just taking a portion of the, let's call it, value chain, or the portion of the process flow, just make it digital. Effectively, we would have to look at it, how can we bring it from beginning to end? At the same time, if you think about new features, this is where, for instance, Flex Installment was one of those new features. This is something you cannot even create in the non-digital world. So this allows us, again, also to generate actually new revenue potential. But everything starts, let's say, from the digital version. So we have the sprints, we have the design workshops, let's say, where they come together in order to come up with the new ideas. So all of this sort of like took place in, particularly at the beginning, when we wanted to showcase towards the rest of the organization how a change actually takes place. Of course, here you can see an example of, let's say, the mobile onboarding. It's not extremely different, even, let's say, from the ones from Revolut or Monzo or anybody like that. I mean, this starts to become, let's say, sort of like almost like a standard feature. But I think also one of the previous presenters already mentioned, let's say, is that making sure is that if you design all of these processes, that particularly the legal, the risk, the compliance units are involved very much early on, so that you don't have to have this ping pong process taking place. And of course, that will ultimately, let's say, save you time, particularly if you want to improve your time to market going forward. And every customer journey after that, let's say, is actually started with the user experience in mind. So we were looking at complaints which we received, for instance, in call center. Then we tried to figure out, okay, so what really went on here? Starting to dig into more deeper into the data, if we actually had the data. And of course, the moment you actually have it in a digital domain, that also allows you digital tools to effectively, let's say, track these steps much better, collect the data much better, and even react a lot more quicker, actually. So nowadays, I think that has a material impact in terms of time to market, but particularly in terms of customer experience. So we launched the mobile app, first, well, call it MVP in September 2018. Nowadays, we're looking closely towards 130,000 mobile users and growing rapidly because of the PSD2 utilization of the mobile app. So that also means that every process we are designing now is in essence built into the digital domain. Okay, let me move on. So that, as I mentioned, so the digital customer journey is effectively the key thing which is sort of like driving it. And any change processes, more or less, let's say, is focused on sort of like how to digitize it, how to improve it, and how to monitor it. And of course, let's say we would like to go to as few manual interactions as possible, just to keep the speed up, but also, let's say, to somehow make sure that the quality is effectively almost at the same level as we can. The only thing what I just underlined here is that if you hear me talking about sort of like this digitalization process, etc., I mean, we have set out clearly when we set the strategy that we're becoming really, and we have to recognize that we are becoming a financial IT company. Of course, you can say, okay, you're a fintech. I mean, fintech, okay, I think that has a bit of a different, sometimes a connotation to it. and I've been following that sort of like, well, trend is it not really, but let's say sort of like market disruption, sort of like coming from this already for a long time. But at the same time, I think if we financial institutions, so the existing incumbents, are not recognizing that we actually are becoming some sort of IT companies, then I think, let's say, that will, let's say, doesn't support sort of like the transformation processes going forward. So I think that we set it out clearly that we are becoming some sort of a financial IT company, really sort of like change people's mindset going forward. So we created a digital lab as well. They have pushed out, as you can see on here on page 11, lots of new things. So we have, for instance, we have a digital onboarding on our mobile, but you also have the tool set, of course, coming from the group. So you have ERSTE Group, which has the George application. So the effectively portion of the onboarding process takes place there as well. We have, apologies. We have biometrics included now as well. So for instance, for the PSD2, you can do a selfie or a liveness detection test actually taking place on the mobile, which actually generates then the M token for you to do your online payments. But we also have, for instance, very boring processes relating to anti-money laundering. We also try to automate those because these ones are, of course, regulatory, extremely important. Look at the fines, for instance, which again were handed out to a Dutch bank, I think a couple of days ago. So that also shows us that you can ultimately use these tools to make sure that you're also staying regulatory compliant and have a good communication towards your customer about this. Travel experience, we are working on that, of course, because as most of you know, the credit card is mostly linked towards airport lounges and these type of things, as well as a merchant platform, because that was the other side of the equation. So what the team did is last year we launched the merchant platform, and that is in essence the tool which we're digitizing all of the functions which are relating to the merchants, and where the merchants, particularly the campaign management tool, which will go live by mid of this year, this will allow the merchants directly to communicate towards the cardholders. Directly, of course, with us in between, but this means they can provide an offer, particular type of discounts. The client will actually see it on the mobile if they're maybe in that particular region or target group. And later on, the merchant will actually see the result of that campaign. So this is all done, let's say, internally. And of course, here you can also see is that, as mentioned, that with the outset of moving towards being a financial IT company, that we're using that, so we're starting to use that as sort of like the more modern technology. So let's say the cloud-based microservices development, et cetera, et cetera. So that will again, let's say, speed up the time to market, as well as, let's call it, the development cycles. Not only one part, of course, is very much sort of like the hardcore in the sense of the technology, et cetera, and the tools. But at the same time, we're also looking very much in terms of digital marketing. Everybody was a little bit skeptical about this in the sense that if it would really bring such a big results, etc. But nonetheless, nowadays, 30% of our cards are being sold completely online. So no more bank branches, and this is growing rapidly. So more and more people are just not going to the branch at all, but just take it fully online and directly with us, but completely driven by a very heavy digital marketing team and resources. So we're spending a lot of money on that, but at the same time, we're also getting in more interesting actually customers coming into that. So what did it result into? So you saw all the developments, you saw all the steps we have taken in terms of digitizing the business, digital marketing, you name it. But it also had a result. So immediately already in 2019, we sold 57% more. So this is partly, of course, as I mentioned at the very beginning, about the contextual things that PBZ had to convert its cars base. So of course, we've driven our competition very much towards targeting their portfolio. And at the same time, making sure that any onboarding from a customer is as smooth as possible. And I think this is sort of like exactly the result of that. But at the same time, by more engaging with our customers and having actually a much directer type of communication tool available, we also saw automatically that the turnover is increasing. So you can imagine that's what this did for our bottom line. Okay, all nice. And the clients, not to forget, and foremost, is that here you see just a testimony of, let's say, one of the customers. Because as I mentioned, wasn't relatively an old-fashioned credit card company. It took sometimes 40 days to actually get the card at the customer. Here you can see, let's say, one of the things is that we're really targeting that the client should get its card, preferably below the 7 days. So that's and that means on the doorstep. So this is really this is what we're monitoring more or less on a day-by-day basis. So what happens behind the scene? As I mentioned earlier, so we are taking a holistic approach. We're looking at every aspect, so the products, the operations, and the go-to-market. But of course, we had to build in the digital capabilities by ourselves. We really had to look at how did we organize it, what kind of roles did we put in, the HR policies we had to address, but also the data analytics and the technology. And let me go a bit more further on that one. So one thing, we were, let's say, somehow designing a digital lab. And you can see here sort of like a digital lab. It had 4 squads in there, which is composed of, let's say, and the 4 squads are composed of, let's call it digital specialists, but at the same time also people from the sales unit, operations unit, you name it. So really sort of like the multidisciplinary mix again. And at the same time, given our, let's call it IT configuration, and I also noticed some questions in the previous presentations already on the IT side. So maybe I can highlight a little bit more on that, is there's a lot of effort to be done to making sure that you somehow get an alignment with these external vendors and internal IT. Internal IT, initially, let's say when we started, this wasn't sort of like super happy because they thought that this was really clearly their domain. What I told them is that, look, that's for sure, but we have a big monolith as a main core system. And that system is, it takes pretty long time to sort of like roll out new features. So it's not extremely agile, but it also has to do effectively with the vendor itself, not as much always with the system. And the mindset, which is somehow, let's say, playing within the IT domain. But they thought that somehow, let's call it the most interesting portion of their work was being taken away. I had to convince them that maybe to a certain extent it was because I needed actually a different skill set, a different mindset, and a more, let's say, sort of like development type of capability with maybe new languages as well. So, and I needed speed. So in that sense, let's say I've taken the choice to somehow start building up with a portion of internal, but at the same time started loading in people from the outside with that skill set. External vendor was much more difficult to convince to actually start playing alongside our development path. But ultimately, let's say they stepped up. And they're completely part of the ceremonies going forward. So that was really appreciated, is that particularly their CEO even started joining as well, together with me, the ceremonies, just to show to the rest of the team that we meant business and that we really wanted to sort of like see this succeed. The setup of this structure of the digital lab had a lot of iterations. We also talked with a couple of consultants. And the point was always sort of like, are we focusing on the tool? So more or less, we're talking about the mobile and all the functionalities effectively, which are part of the mobile, or are we talking about the process and are purely focusing the squad towards the process itself? That was the initial setup. So clearly, as you see here, onboarding as an end-to-end process is in essence there. The only thing is that through time, we've seen is that some of these processes are sort of like so much baked into the core system that it doesn't make too much sense to sort of like keep these people tied into the process or tied in, let's say, to any changes going forward, because that portion of the change I cannot influence. So slowly and steadily, I see is that we're really focusing again towards the tool rather, let's say, towards the process. But it doesn't have to be, let's say, a big issue. But it is a debate. So when we started, let's say, with Agile, of course, first of all, you see here some live pictures, is that we really put everybody in the group. So we really wanted to make sure is that it became a result-oriented process, fast decision-making. Initially, let's say, I was part of the process as well. And when I started to see is that the maturity level sort of like steps up, is that people are getting confident in what they're doing, then effectively I remove myself, let's say, from the process. And really focusing on optimization, ownership for the processes. At the same time, we have to start building digital careers. We didn't really have that. I mean, there were some, let's call it, there was a small digital team there, but that you couldn't really call digital. So we really had to not only train these people, but actually started hiring new people. So we started hiring data analysts, we hired designers, clearly, let's say, some Scrum masters, because the coaching aspect and the repetitive type of process relating to these methodologies really needs to come in, and there needs to be a lot of communication and feedback cycles taking place, which is not always common, at least was not very common, let's say, within this organization. And the new methodologies. So clearly the design workshops are always a great success because everybody likes it, because of course within 1 week you actually see a new process or a new product tested already with a customer. So these type of things really helped as well to somehow distribute agile thinking and performance throughout the organization. But of course, this was very much focused on the development side of it. And my idea was, if I need speed on one thing, I also need speed on the other thing. So at the beginning, we said everybody in the room, and that was really literally trying to get as many people in the room. Most of those people were somehow interested in changing. There were also a lot of people initially coming to the sessions and then didn't turn up on the second time. So they clearly were either not interested but we left it. I mean, we didn't sort of like force people. We just told them, this is the direction and maybe you can learn something more. Then what I noticed is that leadership was a problem, meaning that particularly in the accounting area, and I have a couple of other areas where the leadership wasn't sort of like open to change. They had a very comfortable life, let's call it like this. So I decided to change them. And as such, we have new managers in place, which are much more open to change. And at the same time, sort of like almost naturally onboarded these new agile methodologies, or new, I wouldn't call them new, but okay. So they started applying, for instance, Kanban approaches, and that really helped to showcase towards other areas as well that you can apply these methodologies. And at the same time, what we did as well is to making sure that the entire company received training. Because if you don't know what these new abbreviations mean, or if the jargon is just all of a sudden unusual to them, then most people would either tune out, and we really wanted to let them know what it actually means. The second thing is, of course, the HR adjustments. This was still is not an easy path, because as I mentioned, we're part of a bank. The bank hasn't really gone into this direction, so it's still very much traditional KPI setting, sometimes taking place in the half of the year instead of at the beginning of the year. And these KPIs are just sort of like directed throughout the organization, so that doesn't really match with the prioritization setting, for instance, what happens in the squads. But let me come back to that a little bit later. But we'll still see is that there is sometimes misalignment, or where more explanation actually has to take place, and adjustments of HR policies have to take place. The other thing as well is that digital staff, let's call it like that, has a different expectation level. Now, I'm not saying that they all would like to have a table tennis table or a beanbag, But clearly they would like to be, for instance, much more involved in terms of what their job actually is composed of, and what things they think are relevant for becoming relevant for the organization. That means also different type of discussions on that part, versus where you also have units which just say, just give us the work, we'll just do it. No questions asked. So it brings in also a challenge towards managers to somehow deal with these actually more educated and more demanding employees. And of course, communication has to change dramatically. I mean, we were coming from a very silo-based company. Just to give you an example, I think the worst example I heard when I came in was that people could not talk to the risk managers before 10 o'clock because they were busy. So it just shows sort of like what kind of rule sets they were allowed. Of course, this was the first thing I broke down. But the communication style, as well as how communication takes place within the company, is something which doesn't ever stop, because all the problems, more or less, whatever we continue to have, mostly originates from this. So enormous amount of effort needs to be put in order to make sure is that everybody really understands the direction, what it needs to be done, whose responsibility it ultimately is, but also at the same time showcase the results and reward and showcase where things didn't go right. So all of that requires a lot of effort. So one part was about, let's say, sort of like digital lab and agile. The other part, what I mentioned, is that we needed to change a lot of things relating to the data part, and of course, particularly customer-oriented data. So customer-centric development is a lot more at the forefront nowadays. The first thing people nowadays really ask is, okay, so what does it have on the customers, and how can we mitigate it? Because if you're making changes, you're also upsetting your customer base, particularly if you're an incumbent. If you're a new one, you don't have that problem. If you want to change your existing base towards doing something new, that takes effort, takes a lot of pain, a lot of complaints as well. But then again, if you're convinced that that is the way forward, then you have to do it. But at the same time, you have to do it in the sense that you just don't break down your existing business. So that's the reason why we're using a lot of focus groups. We're burning actually a lot of money also on that to make sure that whatever we do is actually accepted. We're focusing very much the App Store in terms of comments there, particularly nowadays, because we got a lot of negative comments coming in from our customers because they're forced towards somehow using the mobile for online payments, and they have to identify themselves more or less online, which of course brings in the technical problems relating to the mobile phones, what type you have, particularly if you're using these funny Chinese ones. But of course, that generates negative comments, and every comment is singly followed up by people in-house. So we're trying to sort of like go back to them, try to figure out what's wrong, can we fix it, you name it. So that is not just only development, but at the same time also super client-oriented communication and taking place. And not to forget, of course, design thinking. We have two very good designers, and they clearly showcase, let's say, the benefits effectively of these type of methodologies. Next to design and customer-centric development, of course, the data analytics guys. So nowadays, everybody in the company has access to Power BI and thereby the data warehouse. And by this, they can really see what happens on their customer base or on their process, or they can make their own dashboards, but everybody can do it by themselves. And that also helps a lot, puts a lot of pressure away from a traditional IT unit. And it, of course, drives the company towards much more data-driven decision-making, which, of course, again, let's say, supports development flow after that as well. But you can't do all of this if you're not going without the technology. So here you just see a couple of the technology which we introduced. These are not even the most sexy ones, but clearly needed in order to support the new way of working within the company. And Slack, of course, is nowadays the most used channel besides the traditional email for communication purposes, which I think, let's say, is a great addition. Not only within Slack, we also can follow effectively everybody in the company. You can see the client responses. So because we have put some automated engines behind it, that every response from a customer somehow gets logged. And I can see it on my my mobile as well. Okay, so reflections. Well, first of all, organizational design, because Agile is, I think, particularly if you're putting the company on a strategic path to really become, let's say, an IT company, you definitely need to start using some of the methodologies coming from this domain. Of course, we can't forget that we're working in a regulatory environment, and that will just put some limitations towards whatever you can do. Multidisciplinary squads clearly, let's say, poses difficulties towards the formalistic approach. If you think about the traditional job roles, the rewarding systems, these type of things, but that you can sort of like work around. Regulatory is sometimes more difficult. You have to be very careful with compliance roles and risk roles, which you always need to keep somehow independent. But of course, getting them involved early definitely helps processes. Nonetheless, even if you're talking about this, let's call it developmental part of the organization versus the operational part of they still don't really, of course, still don't talk exactly the same language. They're using different methodologies. And that still sometimes creates friction between these two. As I mentioned earlier, the design choice between end-to-end process responsibility or the tool product-oriented is still somehow a balancing act. Because people, of course, are also by their role responsible for a certain section of the process, which of course they would like to control. They would like to minimize risk. They would like to maintain a certain quality, and they can't sort of like in some cases cannot allow, let's say, too much experimentation in that field because it would upset, for instance, their operations figures. So here we are starting to somehow see sort of like where the organization between development, MVP, and quick launch sometimes bounces with the more traditional part of the organization. I think it was also mentioned, I think by Lenka, about the IT part. Let's not forget, if you're talking about, let's call it these type of transformations, the traditional IT won't disappear because you're talking about core systems which are very heavy, very expensive. So you can maybe focus on those parts which are somehow customer oriented, and try to sort of see if you can focus your development on that part, because that's where you really make a difference ultimately, and not so much in terms of the back end. But of course, if you really want to have much bigger speed and try to test out different type of processes, etc., you can't walk away from it. So this is definitely which will come to the agenda at one point in time on the strategic agenda. But okay, I mean, it will need to be sort of like discussed there and then. So in essence, you will end up at the beginning mostly with parallel structures. Which is fine. But again, of course, it talks about resources. So both of them, of course, would like to make sure that they get the right amount of money in terms of capex and these type of things. That still, that's of course, is then ultimately strategically to be decided who gets what of the pie. The digital experts, definitely if you give them a central place in the organization to say, okay, this is the way forward, and to really showcase that we like the different behavior in terms of communication, in terms of speed, in terms of creativity, it's great. I mean, but be careful not to make them gods, because that will start resenting people to say, okay, but everything they do is great. And of course, also these people sometimes make mistakes or sometimes showing some sort of level of arrogance. So you just need to, and I think here's the word again, balancing things. In terms of the organizational design, so when we presented this also towards to the managing board in the bank, just to see sort of like what was their view on our road here. Somehow they got stuck on the fact that Agile sort of like equals Scrum, and they didn't get further than that. And they had some bad experiences in some other places within the group. So they did not know if this was sort of like the way for them going forward. Okay, this is what it is. I mean, we have to take into consideration that particularly in senior bank management functions, you're not talking about the youngest generation, right? I mean, so most of it's like 50 or even sometimes 60 plus type of generations. And it's for them very difficult to come from a traditional command and control type of management structure and behaviors towards a much more democratized, lower in the organization, multidisciplinary approach, which is difficult for them to accept. Then again, they can coach themselves. I think they also should put in an effort to really understand how this works, why this is beneficial for them. And yes, it's not always cheaper, but I think we should listen particularly towards the customer response relating to this. The other parts. So customer centricity, I think it's really helpful with introduction of Agile in the organization, because you really, let's say, have the prioritization in there, and the focus is really much more enhanced. But of course, you're talking about the wider organization. So you really have to put this back under the leadership as well, on HR as well, that this is really, really important, because ultimately it's the customer who pays our salaries. So if we don't have this, I mean, of course, every organization will say that they are customer centric. But then again, saying it and doing it are two different things. But I think clearly Agile helped here a lot. But as I said, it helped. The rest has to come, let's say, with other tool sets as well. In terms of KPI setting, I think we already partly mentioned this. The only thing where it's sort of like self-prioritization, which takes place within the squads, don't always are in alignment with sometimes either strategic level. So from my side is that I see that there's a development in the market, which I think is much more relevant at this point in time. So we saw that particularly, of course, during the COVID situation. You can't have the team, let's say, them prioritizing everything by themselves. So you have to sort of like start taking control back again. But maybe that's more or less due to sort of the nature of the situation as it is there. But you also have some units, which of course, like bigger operations unit, which are much more centrally steered. And as such, if you have self-prioritization units next to operations units, that can somehow create a bit of a clash. Yeah, the resource conflicts, I mean, resource conflicts never go away in whatever situation. And I think sometimes introduction of Agile might even create more or needs more resources. So therefore, if the bucket of resources stays the same, of course, it eats into it. But at the same time, think about this as well, is that if this is really relevant for you as an organization, and you also want to change then the whole IT development cycle as well. So think about DevSecOps type of development. Of course, you need new tool sets. You need different types of resources attached to it. And you might need, let's say, completely different systems attached to it. So it will start also generating effectively need for newer and other resources, which will actually have to come from somewhere else. So it's going to be a balancing act, but it also means you need to start taking decisions to not do certain things. And what was a bit funny at the beginning was that sales didn't sort of like see themselves part of this. Well, we actually told them is that they know the customer best, right? They are in the front line, so we really needed their expertise to get in. But one of the reasons why they were not so keen to it is that they would lose then effectively the selling capacity. But we told them if we don't get this into the development flow as well, then we're losing on both ends. So ultimately, we were able to convince them, but of course, it creates debate. In terms of squad composition, initially it was pretty flexible, meaning that, as said, we wanted to invite people to come in and not allocate people. But what happened as well is that these people started to run as squads very independently, see themselves as a team, and they wouldn't like to somehow go back to the other units again. So they very much would like to stay within that squad in order to continue with development. And of course, their skill set somehow increased, particularly on the digital part in terms of how to do some coding, for instance, or something like this. And they would consider that to be a loss if they would go back, for instance, into the sales unit again. So it starts to become, let's say, much more fixed nowadays, which I don't think is a good thing, because then you get also other type of behavior, let's say, which comes with naturally with that. So we're now trying to sort of like mix it between the different squads. Squad quality. I think most of the points here have already been mentioned. I mean, communication skills, but I think it's in any job, but I think with these type of methodologies, communication skills are critical. So it's worthwhile to make sure that people are really getting good feedback about how well they're communicating, how their behavior, how their responses, let's say, from other colleagues, in order to make it happen. And vendor management, not to forget. We have been, let's say, so we have now done several bigger developments going forward. So we talked about Naoku, so the merchant platform, and of course the mobile. We're also having done a mobile for our Slovenian unit, based on somehow the same platform. And here we involved, I think, 2 other developers, and that's where we started seeing issues. I mean, on the one hand, we're being promised somehow that they can deliver this accordance with a Scrum methodology, and that we have these ceremonies, and but ultimately it turns out that they really like very much waterfall-based approaches, which created very much issues. And of course, that also again has then issues relating to how you manage the pricing, the timing, which of course, let's say, from the financial perspective is very relevant. Okay, I've been talking a lot already, so let me leave it here for the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're not going to have time right now for questions. There is one that's hanging, but I think that we can maybe still somehow ask Akos in the next panel to include it in the, in general, in what he's asking about. And I would like to, so again, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative, super. I think you touched upon so many interesting topics that I have like a bunch of questions in my head, but yeah, I have to stop myself now. So I'm inviting Jörn Leogrande, who is actually now, he's widely recognized in digital transformation and innovation in Fintech. He's also the author of a really successful book, especially recently. It's called Bad Company, My Memorable Career at Wirecard, because Jörn actually spent 15 years there. And he has a lot of valuable experience to share, and he's right now on the path to kind of like refresh a little bit from his times at Wirecard, to put it in words. He has also deep knowledge and experience and strong affinity to spotting trends, and his main expertise is in digitalization of retail and in developing innovative solutions for mobile payments, financial solutions, and open banking. So as usual, I encourage our audience to ask questions. And now I hand it over to Akos, who's going to be the moderator for your panel.
Thank you very much, Fabiola, and thank you very much, Jurgen, for this presentation, because it's always really great to hear such great experiences, like such specific experiences being shared. And thank you very much, Jörn, for also joining us. And you know what, I will not spend too much time with like introductions and stuff like that, because we don't have a lot of time, but there are a lot of questions that I think we should discuss when we are talking about people and technology in agile transformations. And Jurgen, you also pointed out, and Jörn, we also had discussions about this in one of our talks recently, is that basically finance companies and financial companies are getting more and more indistinguishable from tech companies. Pretty much every financial company is somehow becoming a fintech or technology heavy or IT heavy company. And I think it's kind of inevitable that this causes culture clashes. Like an IT culture is very different from a highly regulated traditional financial company culture. How can you manage these clashes? What do you do? How do you make these work together?
Should I? Maybe some words. Jürgen, I really liked your presentation because we share a few of the same the same opinions here. I think the main thing with innovation is not to stay like in this innovation theater, but to create like win-win situations that everybody understands that you take these people further, and you have to respect the certain culture. I think Jürgen mentioned like procurement, IT guys. You have to respect this kind of culture that that there is, and you don't have to, you know, take this traditional innovation approach where you are like a prophet for future developments, but rather take the organization as a whole further. This is what my experience is the only thing that works, to have like deep respect for the people that you're working with, be part of the KPIs, create win-win situations.
Mm-hmm. So basically it's about figuring out the common goals,
right?
That,
exactly.
That the organization can work for.
I mean, that's definitely it. But I think at the same time, it's also, I mean, both parties need to also continue to have, let's say, some sort of an understanding in terms of the role they play within the organization. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, we can't say that, let's say, that you just create an IT structure, an IT infrastructure, or an IT culture with it. Because what I notice as well is that if you do that, we are still a finance company. So the regulatory burden, for instance, on us is still very heavy. And if you don't understand sort of like what is not just the operational implications, but also the financial implications and the customer implications, and then it becomes very difficult also for IT people to really sort of like grasp it, because they're just busy on sort of like, how does this nice fit in the mobile and da-da-da. But ultimately, let's not forget, we make our money by doing let's say, offering a financial service. And that financial service has a revenue pattern, a cost pattern, etc., which I'm not, if I'm listening to my IT people, I don't hear this. So you really need to make sure that different parts of the organization continue to talk to each other and really understand sort of like what is the mindset, where did they come from, what is the perception they have on that particular fraction of our business model.
And do you think, based on this, so basically that also requires a different type of IT culture? It's not just a different type of financial culture that you are describing. Do you think this requires different people in the organization? Like, for example, do you think the same type of IT or technology people are going to be required for ERSTE, who is, for example, a more legacy oriented, coming from a larger legacy, or, for example, a Revolut, or, for example, a purely technology company? Do you hire differently?
But I think you already answered your question by itself. You definitely need, but you need both, right? Because ultimately we can't walk away yet from our big core engines yet. I mean, that just takes time, and therefore the legacy will still stay in for another 5 years, unfortunately, and maybe even longer. But in order to make sure that you really benefit from all the new technologies which are effectively out there, you definitely need to start hiring these people as well. So, and for that, in order to make yourself interesting, that's a challenge as well. So for the HR side, to making sure is that they can also present that IT in our landscape is not just the traditional C+ type of environment, but it's effectively also the the more fancy coding skills which they can use. And sometimes it's even better not to put them together, because that sometimes even creates more frustration. So yeah, again, HR challenges coming in.
Mm-hmm. I think that from my experience, really, at my former employer Wirecard, the IT was really part of the product development unit for the CPO organization. And all the main IT guys, they have to spend a lot of hours in product meetings, actually. So really understand productization. Although I have to say, a lot of IT guys, and I think we mentioned this beforehand, are stuck in very nerdy areas. Yeah, they want to create something, they want to build something. They're not looking at the use case. They're not looking directly at the customer experience. And this is something that has to change in taking product and technology further together.
And do you think traditional financial managements speak the language of customer experience in this case? So basically what you are describing a little bit is customer experience or the customer's benefit as kind of like a common language between technology and finances.
I think a lot of people from the traditional banks understand the needs of the customers, but in a lot of cases, they can't build up agile processes like we started before in a fast time, because there are a lot of legacy systems, right? There is no one in Deutsche Bank, I think, it's not seeing what N26 over Revolut is doing, actually. It's pretty easy. People can watch how things turn. But can they really change? Because they are connected to tons of systems that are running on in different clusters, in different organizations and stuff like this. And this, I think, is the benefit of the startups, that they really can start from scratch building up an agile system. In Germany, if you talk to Raiffeisenbank, Sparkasse, or others, I think they feel the need to become more customer-centric. But on the same hand, it takes months or years to change something. So at least it's my experience.
Mm-hmm. Actually, you just answered one of the questions that were hanging from the audience, which was whether the fast success of these startups like the N26s and the Revoluts of the world can be attributed in a big part to them being able to start from scratch. But actually, I anyway wanted to follow up on that question in a way that, okay, so like some companies, like some traditional financial companies, are trying to solve this problem by compartmentalizing their innovation and their IT. Like ERSTE and George is a good example for that, when basically in a separate entity, in a separate culture, they are trying to build this innovation capability. And a lot of companies are choosing this direction, while a lot of companies are trying to choose the direction of transforming their existing operations. Do you think there is one better than the other?
I mean, I think okay. It's a very difficult question, because of course it depends institution by institution in terms of what is your starting point. Is your starting point that you have a very strong position in the market? I mean, are you being attacked, for instance, by, let's say, these digital players? So, and maybe you already have invested, let's say, somehow in your IT domain significantly in order to be flexible, and you have a pretty decent time to market, etc., etc. So then let's say maybe in that case it's less. But if you look, everybody has its own way, let's say, because ERSTE didn't come up, let's say, with the George part somehow by itself like that, right? I mean, it's also partly grown because of a little bit of trial and error. We tried it sort of like outside, we tried it inside. I mean, so for certain institutions, even within ERSTE, we are using different methodologies. I mean, remember Česká has gone through a complete overall very big transformation process, agile at scale, while other ones like in Hungary are just, let's say, trying to test it out on a very small scale, because maybe the management is a bit more afraid to embark on such a pretty big transformation. and maybe their market position either doesn't allow them or they just don't want to risk it. So again, it's really an individual approach here. I wouldn't say one versus the other.
I just can only talk about innovation units more or less, and I think that for the innovation people, it's super important to be not to be detached from normal processes and stuff like this. I mean, we all have seen this, like innovation labs outside in fancy startup looking houses and stuff like this. I think this is not going to work because you end up in a kind of endless innovation theater that takes you from POC to POC, from prototype to prototype. But I think it's super important that innovation is kind of lived by the entire organization, and that you are connected to this organization and not having this like consulting view on the world, right? Before I was running innovation at Wirecard, I was for 5 years running a product division called Mobile Services. And I think this is a nice little education to come really from product development to innovation, because you know how hard it is to take like a prototype to something that is creating revenue, which is a lot of my colleagues that I met didn't have this experience. And I think this is sometimes missing to understand how complex it is and how long it takes and how you have to align with the entire organization to get something going.
Yeah, I can absolutely really relate to that, because this is something that we meet very often in our practice, that companies are great at running the traditional business, at the same time really great at running their innovation hubs. What they can't really figure out is how to connect the products that come out from their innovation centers and integrate it to their everyday operations. And there's one, actually, we are almost running out of time, but there is one question that I really wanted to ask, which is more about culture in the technology environment. So basically, Jurgen, you also pointed it out, that when a company is going into a transformation, like for example, an agile transformation, but it could be also a customer centricity transformation, that usually means that from a more command and control type of operation, people as an employees have to be more free about defining their own roles and defining what they are doing for the company. They have to become more kind of purpose oriented. While at the same time, these are people that are used to a command and control type of operation, usually in traditional companies. But are there any ways to manage this insecurity of people, or manage this transformation from people having very well-defined roles and moving into less defined, more free roles?
I mean, the strongest message is, of course, the message which comes from the top. I mean, so leadership counts here. So if I don't allow people to experiment, or actually, and by experimenting also, not so making some mistakes or not doing everything perfect or anything like this. I mean, okay, that should be sort of like encouraging that we're not into this domain. But to learn off a command and control structure or sort of like behavior, for some people it's practically impossible. So therefore it's better, let's say, just to start replacing some of them, and to really, let's say, start highlighting. I mean, it falls almost the logical HR processes, right? I mean, start highlighting the best behaviors, just to recognize them and reward them, and to show for the rest of the organization, oh, this is the way you should go to. So it's very much driven by sort of like the tone from the top.
Yeah, I would say the same. It's like, if you don't have C-level support on certain areas, you will not. This is going to work. On the other hand, I saw that in the organization I was working in, if you really have like rock star developers or something, people that are really relevant for product or delivery or something, you will not be able to take these people out of the organization. This is practical. It's impossible. As in my last jobs, it was not the case. So you have to involve them in on a low level scale, I would say, because they have their entire roadmaps. They have clients, they have solutions they have to develop. And it's for me, it was rather the situation that I wanted to talk to these people, or my team wanted to talk to these people on a regular basis and really having their view on something rather than freeing them, because this was not possible actually. So you have to understand, I think, every organization in a different manner. But like I said, it has to, these kind of initiatives have to be covered by C-level, otherwise around it will not work.
So basically, for these kind of cultural changes, you just need the leadership buy-in.
Yeah.
But how do you do that? Sorry, it's my last question. How do you do that with the management that is obviously coming from traditional finances? So how do you get these buy-ins from?
Yeah, sorry, Jürgen, please.
I mean, the only way, let's say, okay, within ECC, let's say there's no higher level, so that's not difficult. But if I'm looking at sort of like at the bank side, so when we started presenting that why this is relevant, for some it started sort of like dawning to them that it's okay. I mean, that you really showcase, because I think ultimately the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? So if you can showcase, look, if you do it this way and you end up here, then ultimately there is a result. And if they see that the result is really liked by customers and it helps them to somehow achieve their goals, then you have an alignment. So you again, it's I think what was talked about earlier, you need to find a win-win here. And then people are open to it. But then again, not all people are open to it. I mean, if you have a very, let's call it an old-fashioned traditional banker, it's, you know, you're just not going to change them. So then it's better, let's say, maybe to put somebody next to that person, maybe to educate or to showcase.
Yeah,
the hard part of the management change.
Yes.
Yeah, time will lead to a change naturally. So in my opinion, a lot of people see what digitalization is offering them, and if you create a win-win situation, if you talk about sustainable revenues and stuff like this, I think that also management will not block you, but you have to go in this direction and really, you know, create something that is measurable and really taking the organization as a whole further.